Welcome to today's webinar on how to select enterprise collaboration and social software technology. My name is Scott Dill. I'm on the business development team here at Real Story Group, and my colleague Kashyap Campbell will be on the line with us shortly to walk through the heart of today's presentation. A couple of quick housekeeping items of note. If you do have questions at any point during the webinar, you can feel free to add those into the questions tab in the GoToMeeting control panel, and we'll get to those either during the presentation or at the very end. Also, for our subscribers on the line, you'll be able to access a recording of the presentation in your library within the next couple days. And you're also encouraged to attend a webinar we'll be hosting tomorrow at this same time, where it will be a bit of a vendor smackdown, so to speak, where we'll be taking a deep dive look at IBM, Jive, and Microsoft, and the strengths and weaknesses of those products against each other in the social collaboration technology marketplace. For those that are new to Real Story Group, welcome. Happy to have you join us. You'll also receive the slides from today's webinar within the next couple of days from our marketing team, and certainly want to walk you through a little bit about our company and what we do. So our main focus is to help our customers select the technology product that's the right fit for their unique needs. We really want to provide you with the right information at the right time. So what we offer is detailed evaluations of over 150 vendors in the digital workplace and digital marketing technology world. And also, we have tools that allow you to really narrow down those vendors to a short list that is based on your specific needs and use cases, so then you can make a very well-informed technology choice. We also have a product called Real Score, which allows you to benchmark the effectiveness of your current technology, people, and processes, and then benchmark yourselves against industry peers as well as across a variety of industry verticals, and then really see some visual examples of where your business can improve and how you're matching up against those within your industry. So our coverage areas are, like I said, really broken down into two main buckets, which are digital workplace and digital marketing technology. Our focus today is going to be on enterprise collaboration and social software. We're currently evaluating 23 of the most significant vendors in that particular marketplace, and we've recently actually published an update which covers some of the market trends within that particular area, along with SharePoint 2016 is part of that research as well. And we've actually updated our criteria a little bit in how we're evaluating those vendors. So we certainly encourage you, if you haven't already, to download a sample after today's presentation so you can get a better feel for our research and how we evaluate vendors. And one thing that we offer is also our digital technology vendor subway map, sort of a famous or infamous, if you will, way of looking at our coverage areas as well as the different vendors that we evaluate within our research. Today, again, Kashyap is going to walk us through the collaboration market, and with that, I'll hand things over to him.
Great. Thanks, Scott, for setting that context and intro to RSG. And a warm welcome to all of you who are joining here. It's wonderful to have all of you here today. As you can see, we cover a variety of digital workplace and digital marketing technologies. As you can see, there's quite a bit of an overlap amongst them as well. But today, we're going to focus on this red line, which is enterprise collaboration and social software. So if you like this map, you can get a high resolution version of this on realstorygroup.com/map/vendor map. So what I'm going to talk today is a methodology for selecting the right technology. The central question that animates all of our research is really what's the right fit product or technology for you. So we'll leave you with a methodology that's been tried and tested across several consulting engagements for us. And then we are also going to talk about the selection criteria, if you will, and we'll share our own evaluations methodology that we use in our own research when we come up with these deep dive vendor evals. Then I also talk a little bit about the vendor landscape. What are the different tools that are out there and how they differ from each other and how they're similar to each other. Then finally, I'll leave you with a selection process, which we refer to as an agile selection process. So during any time during this webinar, if you have any questions at all, or if there is anything that you agree with or disagree with, please feel free to use the question tab in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll get to those questions or comments towards the end of this. So without further ado, let's jump into it. In terms of selection criteria, we divided them into a few categories. First, it's functional and enterprise services, and I'll show you what those exactly are in a minute. But I think the most important in terms of fit here is the second one, that is the actual scenario fit or the use case fit, because that really is what drives your actual business value. After that, there are finally strategic considerations around the vendor and ecosystem. These are also critical success factors, and we'll talk about them. So let's first start with the functional and enterprise services, because for better or worse, this is where many enterprises do start, because here we are still in the comfort zone of enterprises. We're talking about features and functionality. So from a feature perspective, this is what we look at when we're doing the deep dive evaluations of the vendors. So we group them first into a couple of categories that you see on the screen here. By the way, as Scott mentioned, this approach was completely updated as of just last quarter when we released the latest version of our collaboration and social software research. We're really excited about it because we very much modernize a lot of the criteria that we use as part of this update. So in terms of just straight up features, we've divided them into personal productivity services and collaboration services. So from a personal productivity, you have things like profile services, filtering and search, and potentially things like a personal dashboard. And when you get over to the collaboration side of things, that is things that you do in the course of your work as you're working with your colleagues, things that you do with other people, social signals and that sort of a thing. You have commenting and rating, you have blogging and discussion services. These are, you find that in these sort of services or features are very critical to many of the applications. Same is the case with collaborative editing, team tasks, and calendaring. So this is kind of a set of features. And to be more accurate, these are a set of end user features. And these are very important, make no mistake. But unfortunately, this, as I mentioned before, this is where many enterprises just sort of start and end their selection process. But I mean, there is much more to this. So here are some things that you want to keep in mind. First, in terms of enterprise services. These are obviously, I mean, really important as well. But sometimes we find that these end up being an afterthought in the selection process. And that can be a real problem because issues don't always crop up when you're piloting something at a departmental level. But then when you try to take that pilot and scale it across the enterprise, suddenly you start facing some of these issues. So then you have a problem on your hands. At RSG, we call it the enterprise surprise. So what this enterprise surprise or shock is that here you have a social collaboration platform that's really working well at a departmental or regional level, but it isn't working so well at a global level. So just to stay on that for a bit. So if you take the example of user experience, so things that your IT team perhaps thought are easy to use, but non-IT people, your colleagues in different departments may find them a little more difficult and more complex, and so adoption stalls because of that. So you see that a lot when it comes to things like wikis and collaborative editing tools. Or to give another example, if there is a tool that isn't properly localized for all of the different languages that you need to support on a global basis, you'll again enter into these sort of issues. So next, we come to the heart of the issue, which is really the collaboration or criteria business fit. No, actually, I think I want to go back for a bit and talk about a few other important criteria. Obviously, configuration management, lifecycle management, these are very important, particularly in environments where compliance and regulatory issues are important. I mean, needless to say, scalability, security, and entitlements, these also become very pertinent as you get into larger multi-business unit sort of enterprises. So the point about enterprise services is that they're not glamorous or sexy, but they can be very important for your success. So far, as you've seen, we're still talking about the tools and features, both end user features as well as these enterprise or admin level features. But now what I really want to focus you is on the most important set of criteria, these ones which actually drive the real business value. And we've released recently a bunch of interactive applications. And even for these applications which let you access our research, we have consciously made the choice that these business scenarios are what are going to drive the design and development of those applications. So let's talk a bit about these common scenarios. Whether consciously or unconsciously, vendors target these different scenarios, even though they're not very explicit about it. So these are across hundreds of engagements and projects. We've seen that most of the business requirements fall into these 10 common scenarios or business use cases. On the left are those that are more collaborative or traditional collaboration oriented, like building gold knowledge bases, repeatable project collaborations, collaborating with external partners, and so on and so forth. So among these, team communication is relatively new. This is a scenario that tools like Slack are addressing. Innovation support and idea management and open innovation, then you see a lot of interesting use cases around that as well. So when you move towards the right, these use cases are a little more social oriented, if you will. Things like socializing existing work streams, developing communities of interest or community of practice, social answers, or we increasingly refer to this as the answer engines. A lot of great use cases around that. Expertise location, again, a lot of very interesting applications in professional services, in the legal industry, etc. And lastly, conversation and news. This again may be a little more prosaic, but it's really important in a social context, in the corporate internal communications context. So these are use cases, business applications that drive business value. And in fact, as I mentioned before, this is one of the two pillars or dimensions of our own tools that we've developed. But so we've talked about the features, the business applications that these features help you realize, but then there is one more dimension, which is not really so much around what the product can do, but these are strategic considerations. So we've clubbed the strategic considerations around three buckets. These relate to the vendor, the product, and the ecosystem. So let's start by talking about the strategic considerations in connection with the vendor. Obviously, you want to look at their professional services, particularly with the cloud-based solutions. It could be very important as they could be doing your professional service. I mean, you could be using their professional services for your implementations. You'd want to check how good is their customer support, or you really want to know how bad is their customer support going to be. So for most vendors, that's what we're talking about in our evaluations. Of course, I mean, you want to know what's their overall strategy, their viability and stability, and that's important because that will determine how rocky your journey with them is going to be. So this is a bit interesting because we often find that it's an assumption that small vendors are not as viable. So there is some reservations about the viability of small vendors, particularly when you're talking about large enterprises. But paradoxically, smaller vendors can be more stable than larger vendors in some situations because they don't do as much M&A activity. They don't move things around or kill or sunset products. To give you an example, in the recent months, there has been a lot of chatter and concerns about the future of Yammer and Microsoft. But just think, if Yammer were a freestanding company, you wouldn't be worrying about that so much because social collaboration would be their bread and butter. It's all they would do, and their livelihoods depended on it. But I mean, hypothetically, Microsoft could tomorrow decide that in the context of some of the larger things they're doing around Exchange or some other product, they just don't want Yammer anymore. So viability or stability are important, and I just highlighted the fact that don't just look at the vendor size, but also the likely future of a product. So after the vendor strategy considerations, you want to consider the product. So that there is a tendency again to look a lot about product roadmaps. Of course, I mean, we do look at product roadmaps, but we find that they're perhaps not as important as the underlying technical architectures and frameworks, or we dub this as technical modernity. So this is another way of saying how much technical debt are you going to take from day one or in the future going forward. And this, the technical modernity is, we see it time and again, it's under considered in many selection processes. So we end up with a product that's several years behind the current state of the art. And of course, value for money, which is really, what are you paying? I mean, are you paying the right amount? And what's your overall TCO, total cost of ownership, going to be given the value that you're going to derive out of this product? So the last but not least, strategic consideration, in fact, this is probably the more important when you're considering the long term, is around the ecosystem, the strategic considerations around the ecosystem. So in our estimation, this is one of the best predictors of the overall longevity and the technology health. This is very highly correlated to the health of the ecosystem in terms of channel partners, service partners, the overall community strength, and the extent to which you can rely on third-party add-ons and extensions to enhance the experience or integrate the experience of the tools that you're selecting. So this is again really critical for your long-term success. So next, I mean, so far some of the things may have been abstract, so I want to tie all of this with an example. So at this point in time, I'm going to use an example from our evaluations research here. I'm just going to use one vendor as an example. And so for all of you out there, can you guess which vendor do you think this is? I have the rating snapshot for one of the vendors, one of the 23 vendors that we evaluate. I'm going to give you the name in a bit, but please do type in if you think you can guess which vendor this is. So, by the way, we have similar charts and ratings and page-to-page narratives to back this up for each one of the nearly 24 vendors that we evaluate. But coming back to this chart, it's kind of interesting. And this vendor does reasonably well in terms of the productivity services, decent presence and instant messaging capabilities, a decent but not a great mobile client. It allows you to follow colleagues and that bucket of services. But if you look at the middle, it tends to fall down a bit there in the more wide-ranging collaboration services. Here, the focus is really on microblogging and activity. So that should be a hint for you to see which product this could be. But it doesn't provide a lot of other support for the more collaboration-oriented things that you want to accomplish in a large enterprise setting. And all of this feature lightness is going to play out in a lot of different ways that we will talk about in a bit. In terms of enterprise services, this is great at security and entitlements, and also certainly scalability and reliability. But this is available only in the cloud and as SaaS, so that's both plus and minus. But now, what are some of the things that you don't get with this vendor? I mean, you can see community management is a blank. The user experience also is not very customized, though this specific product is localized across an impressive number of languages. So overall, when you step back and look at this product kind of gets mixed reviews here. So yes, a couple of you have been able to guess that it's Yammer. In fact, a lot of you said it's Yammer, and you're correct. So the more interesting thing when you talk about Yammer is when you start lining it up against the use cases that I talked about before. And here's where you really start to see the essence of the tool in a business context. So this is really what we try to explain about Yammer or a specific product from a business use case perspective. It's simply not very strong. You can do some team communication, but certainly it is no Slack. And even Microsoft has built their new Microsoft Teams tool as a completely different product. You can do a little bit of external collaboration, but it's limited by the lack of file sharing, effective file sharing. So when you look at Yammer, and this is no surprise, it tends to target more the social use cases, but it's really only good at, and even then in only an average kind of way, in conversations and news. I mean, to be sure, you can do many of the other use cases with Yammer, and many people have tried, but you end up kind of fighting against the stream here. So I think this one slide shows the promise and the limitations of Yammer in the enterprise today. But you get this understanding not by so much focusing on the features, although the features are important, but by looking at the actual use cases that it's trying to fulfill and how it's executing against those. So this is the perspective and the criterion you'll find all through our research. And I invite you to download some samples and just look at it yourself. So now switching gears slightly, in terms of the actual vendors that we cover, I mean, they run the gamut. Of course, there are the major platform vendors, IBM, who's really pushing connections these days, but it seems like a bit of an appendage to some of the other IBM efforts around portals and document management. It's not necessarily a bad thing. There are pros and cons to that. I'll talk more about this in tomorrow's subscriber webinar when we do a smackdown of IBM and Microsoft and Jive. So please do join that as well. Of course, there is Microsoft, and you have SharePoint and Office 365, which are increasingly very divergent environments. And our latest research goes into a lot of depth there. Oracle, which seems to have only a glancing interest over the years, but only recently it's pushing a lot through their HR tools. But I think this experiment is not succeeding really. A lot of the major suites are very interesting. In many cases, they either extend or even replace what the platform vendors can do. A lot of flux and change in the Drupal ecosystem, and we can talk offline if you're interested about it. Google is going after the enterprise market, but in essence, they're still very much an SMB play despite some big ticket deals that they've won. SAP's ambition seems to be limited to their walled garden itself, which is considerable in size, yeah. And Jive, of course, is a long-standing player with many global customers, global 2000 customers. A lot of interesting things are also happening in these smaller suites like Atlassian, and a lot of social intranet in a box vendors like Igloo, Interact, and Thought Farmer. And then you have this social enterprise layers and SharePoint supplements, Yammer, of course, being the most well-known, but also Nudesic, TIBCO, Citrion, which is former Newscater, most certainly Salesforce Chatter, and VMware. Lastly, on this side, you have some specialist players, Harmony, which is filling in some gaps for the Microsoft stack, and Slack, which almost came out of nowhere and really focused on the team communication use case, which there are other tools, but really hasn't received that much attention in recent years from a use case perspective. When you look at this landscape, of course, there are several other smaller players. You could extend this in many ways. You could add another item or category, and you can add any number of tools in some of these buckets as well. But we tend to think, I mean, we've been following this marketplace for quite a few years, and we tend to think that these are some of the most important tools you want to look at. And we're going to add a new vendor here, which is Workplace by Facebook. We're kicking the tires on that, and before the end of this month, we'll add an evaluation of the Workplace by Facebook. So increasingly, our take on this is you're going forward in the digital workplace, you're likely to have like multiple numbers of these tools. They're going to solve for different use cases in different ways. So we return to this question of, so how do you figure out what's the right fit for you? Of course, there is a tendency to say that there is that best product, right? I mean, you can always find a quadrant to support you. Somehow there is this belief that the right answer will reveal itself, the right product will reveal itself as a magical place in a mystical quadrant. And there are a lot of high priest advocates advocating this approach. But we offer an alternative to this, which is called the Real Quadrant. And this Real Quadrant uses all of our research at the back end. So it's possible that with the same research, with the same product, same vendors, you can end up with very different winners and very different losers. So by the way, this is actually using some real data from our enterprise portals research, which is somewhat similar to collaboration, but a little different. So you could be justified in asking how is it that you use everything the same, the exact research, but still end up with different quadrants. That's because these quadrants are really sensitive to the assumptions behind them. So by tweaking the preference weights, these weights are nothing but customer requirements and customer preferences. You can end up with very different quadrants. So just to reiterate here, the x-axis here is the scenario fit, which is how well does the vendor execute on the scenarios that we talked about. And the y-axis is the strategic considerations. So you can actually go into our tool, you can weight how important the scenarios are and weight how how important the different strategic considerations are. And then the tool generates a personalized or a customized quadrant that exactly fits your requirements. So you can generate multiple quadrants. So the example that you're seeing here is the one use case where the emphasis was on internal collaboration and a lower cost of ownership. So you got one set of vendors here. Notice how Plone and SAP are at different ends of the spectrum. And then, but another customer, if they're looking for a portal use case that's more for business intelligence and dashboards, and they want some external help, some professional services to help implement that. And you see that the two vendors, Plone and SAP, have essentially swapped. They got swapped out into the quadrants. So same research, same product, same vendors. I mean, the takeaway is that a generic quadrant is not going to get you where you want to go, but a more customized or real quadrant that's based on your individual needs is, I would say, the way to go. So I would again encourage you to just log on to our site and go to the tools area and test this for yourself. So in this next last section, we have about 3-4 minutes left. So I'm going to talk a bit about the process. So hopefully you've access to some good research, vendor evaluations research, and you create your own custom shortlist and you get your teams aligned that. In a sense, what you're trying here is you're trying to figure out what are the scenarios that you're going to look at, and while focusing on practical applications, then try to identify, you may also want to try to identify the common areas where the business units may be self-procuring solutions. I mean, there's all this talk of shadow IT and shadow applications. So you want to get ahead of that and see if there can be common solutions that can be procured for these things. So you want to make sure that you carefully test these tools, particularly if you want to extend them beyond an individual department and test some of the enterprise services like scalability. For example, this has been an issue with Slack at some level in some organizations. You just don't want to jump the gun and face troubles later on. Essentially, you want to avoid the four traditional approaches of selection. The first one, the horse race, we sort of talked about in the quadrants: who's ahead, who's winning, who's behind types. The second approach that you see here is the puppy love or love at first sight. I mean, you saw a tool, it looks really cool, it works great for you and your four colleagues in the same department. Therefore, you assume that it's going to work for everyone else. And that's how really it doesn't work. Similarly, there is this my cousin Winnie approach, which is it worked well over here in that other organization, so it's going to be working well for us. But the reality is that your requirements are different, even if you're in the same industry. Yes, I mean, it's important to see what your peers in the industry are doing, but that should not be the only criterion, because you need to assess your own level of maturity and your ability, your culture, and that's very important in terms of social collaboration. So you just don't rely on the advice of others. And the fourth one is really about death by checklists. So you come up with these extremely detailed and granular set of functional requirements, and you send these across to the vendors. And the vendors are very adept at this thing so that they can happily check all your boxes. But then, in a sense, the more time you really end up doing that, you're ignoring the real business applications and requirements that you should be focusing on. So what you want to do really is an agile process or an empirical way in which you set up a series of increasingly intimate interactions or processes or phases where you could start with an RFP And if you're doing the demos, do with your own use cases, with your own people getting trained, getting hands-on, and trying it out, a competitive proof of concept, and maybe a pilot that's with the implementation team that you want to do, because you're going to spend a lot of money on services as well. So you want to get a feel for that as well. One last thing I'd call out here is this concept of the employee-centered design, which is taking the concepts of user-centered design and applying it to the employee perspective. You're really taking this from the employee's perspective, understanding what tasks they want to do, what they can get out of this technology, and moving forward with personas and journeys to do that. So that was a very brief and quick tour of the criterion, the marketplace, and the selection approach. So I want to leave you with this mind map to sort of remind you of our recommended approach. So unfortunately, we've run out of time here, but I will pass it back to Scott for the next steps while I'm going through some of the questions here.
Thanks, Kashyap. That was great information on the right way to select social collaboration technology. As I'm sure you all can imagine, based on the approach that we take, is we really take a pull no punches type of approach to our research. We don't believe there's a best vendor or a worse vendor, but rather what's going to be the right fit for your particular use cases, scenarios, and strategic considerations. And that's why we've developed the tools such as Real Quadrant that we walk through from a high level. And if that's something that you want to have a more thorough demonstration of, along with the rest of our interactive applications, we certainly encourage you to email us at explore@realstorygroup.com. A couple of quick reminders. First, tomorrow's webinar for our subscribers will be the vendor smackdown on the social collaboration technology market. And also for everyone, next week we'll be hosting another webinar such as this on digital marketing technology and the best way to select a vendor in that particular area. So whether that's for you or your colleagues to log in, we certainly hope you can join us for that. And I believe a couple of questions have come in. Is that right?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions about the webinars, and I think you got that, Scott. There was a question about workplace, and yeah, like I said, we've already added to the Subway map, and we'll be adding the Well chapter later this month to this stream. So there are still a few more questions. I apologize because of paucity of time. I'm not able to get back to you now, but I will get to them via email tomorrow. So that's it from us here today.